Hey everybody, this is Erica Mello, and just a quick intro to the podcast today. This is a former patient of mine who had persistent pelvic pain, and chief complaint just could not power up hills, had no power in her hamstring, really couldn't walk her dog. She was super hypermobile, as a lot of these complex patients are. And Susan and I look at some really interesting movement patterns that I like to assess, and we both like to assess with running. And obviously, her pelvis was not the source of the problem here. I hope you enjoy it. And thanks again for all of the reviews on iTunes. We really appreciate it. Hey everybody, this is Erica Mello and Susan Clinton.
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. I think as of this podcast, we both have come back from traveling, so it's been a long first quarter.
That it has.
Okay, so this podcast is going to be quite unique and probably won't be as long as our other podcast. So it is, I'll sort of just get right to it, Susan, if that's okay with you.
Sounds good to me. Let's go.
Okay, so this patient is, I don't think she is still a physio. I think she went back to medical school. This was a physical therapist who came to see me probably a couple of years ago. And she was actually a women's health therapist, by the way. And her husband was in Baltimore and he was doing a residency there. So she could not work as a physio because she was Canadian here in America. So she was doing other things. Anyway, she had been complaining about left SI joint pelvic pain on her left side and a lack of hamstring power, like pushing up a hill when she runs, and also in a pull in her left leg, probably or in her hamstring, when she was in yoga doing like a lot of forward bends. And she had been on some courses in the past, and they're, and as a subject as well. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to figure out what her issue was or what the cause of her problem was. So I'll just repeat it again. Left SI joint pelvic pain, lack of hamstring power on the left with running, pushing up a hill, and a pull in her left leg when she did some forward bending in yoga. And she also, on the side, did Pilates, and I think she took her Pilates certification program as well. She was a runner and had done a couple of marathons, and I think this all began when she started to do more yoga, started to ramp up the running, and then also started to finish her Pilates certification program. And a couple things, I'll just say a few things, and Susan, you can tell me what you look at before you even meet the patient.
Sounds good.
So since she was a runner, and a lot of it had to do with running and walking, she also had a problem walking her dog for long distances when she held the leash in her left hand.
Okay.
And so with a runner, I tend to look at two things right off the bat, just because they're running. I look at actually seated thoracic rotation because of the arm swing or the arm movement in running. That's what I look at beginning. No matter where their complaint is, I just look at it. And I also look at either a one-legged stance or a one-legged mini squat, because we don't run with straight legs. I try to watch them run. If I can't do it in the first visit, I'll do it in a subsequent visit. And there's a really good app that I found. I think I mentioned this in the other podcast. It's called Huddle, Hudl. I found this, I learned this at the Shirley Sarman course last year. And you can video them running, and you can drop it down to a quarter speed, an eighth speed, and make marks and things like that. So before I go into her evaluation, that's what I kind of look at with running, and then I'll add other things. I don't know if you have something that you do immediately when you see a runner.
Yeah, actually, that's a great point. Before we even move into that, I'm just going to talk tech here for a second. Is Huddle more user-friendly than Coach's Eye?
Yes, I think
Coach's
so.
Eye? Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Excellent to know. Okay, so all of you out there who want to record and monkey with movement and videoing, Huddle, Hudle, may be the way to go. I've been using Coach's Eye a little bit, but not as successfully as I would like to.
Yeah.
So it'll be fun to check this out. I'll look at it. Okay. Running, walking, long walking, the sagittal plane dominant movement.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whenever I hear that somebody is spending a great deal of their time in their exercise world in the sagittal plane, that always begins to kind of think about maybe some dominant stuff has, you know, dominant patterns in that plane have crept up. And we as humans do spend a lot of time in the sagittal plane anyway. So if our only form of exercise is that too, I begin to kind of think about pattern development and maybe, you know, like the exclusivity of maybe some variance and some other things around there. When I look at people who are runners or walkers and they're having pain, the question becomes to me is, where are their symptoms? Not that their symptoms are always where the problem is, but in this case, and in a lot of patients that I see, it's either, you know, along the front or along the back. And for her, it's down the back. So it kind of makes me start to wonder about, okay, well, what's going on here? Is this a compression thing that's happening because of muscles that are switching off, because maybe of how she's lining herself up underneath gravity with her running and walking, and with walking with a dog with a leash, you kind of think about kind of almost leaning back and pulling back. Running, I've seen this a lot with females that tend to kind of just lay back onto their heels a little bit. So their whole, you know, postural area comes backwards. And so that could either set up, you know, compression over time or just muscles that aren't activating because they're not in a position to activate. When you're in positions like that and you hear about the hamstring stuff, then it's kind of like, wow, why is that hamstring having to work so hard? You know, and then now she's having problems that way. So before we even get into the power piece, which I think is kind of a big deal there for me, I would be wanting to really kind of understand what that power piece is all about. Is, you know, you look at seated rotation, the first thing I look at is standing rotation because I usually have them on their feet. So, but I,
well, that's true. I do that too.
You know, but I just, no, but I mean, the idea is that we're going after rotation first. I mean, because that's what I look at is like, what does a transverse plane, you know, rotation look like? So in standing, I look at the feet, the knees, the hips, the low back, the T-spine, the head, and the eyes. And what I usually find all the time is that they never turn their head and their eyes around unless they're coached. You know, which is kind of weird to me because we're just blindly rotating, you know, and as humans, we should be anticipating, which means the eyes and head should actually, if you think about the way humans are set up, should come first, you know, and come around. So I'm not sure if that's just a, you know, lack of expectation or if it's just kind of a trend and pattern that I'm seeing with clients. So it's very interesting. You look at single leg. I love single leg. You can find out so much in single leg. But before I get there, I generally look at a bend over, a squat, and then we'll go to a single leg and a single leg squat, and or a hop if I think they can do it, if they're not in too much pain. Because if you're going to implicate the SI joint, hopping is usually a good way to implicate it. But anyway, interesting.
Cool.
So
she also sprained, I'm just looking at my notes here, she also sprained that left ankle of hers. So everything was on her left side, probably in about 2009, and which while she was running. So she was really getting frustrated, and she said, is it the lack of strength in my hamstring? I said, probably not. It's probably just it's just inhibited. I don't think you're, you know, you're weak. So what I ended up doing, so the first thing I probably saw, since she was standing first, I probably looked at one-legged stands. I mean, I basically did a quick postural screen because my whole thing is if the person has an issue when they're upright, just quickly look at it, something in standing, something's jumping out at you, make note of it. If they had a problem sitting, I would probably not spend a ton of time there. But so I had her stand on one leg, and her left side was the main issue. So I said, let's stand on your right leg. Let's see how you do. No problem. She was pretty strong. I didn't see any major shifts or anything that jumped out at me. And I actually do everything barefoot. Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So I forgot to mention that. So I take the socks, I take the shoes off, everything.
Yep.
And when I had her stand on her left leg, she was all over the place. Her thorax shifted left, her pelvis shifted right. She was gripping with her toes. I mean, it was really hard for her to do. And I said, okay, let's start there, because if she can't do a one-legged stance, it may be difficult for her to do a one-legged squat, or I'll probably see the same thing, which I did. So I said, okay, I had her do it a few times. And the first thing that I saw that that just went, or the first dysfunction or improper movement or whatever you want to call it, was her foot. So the minute she stood on that left leg, the toes were gripping, and then it went the pelvis and then the thorax. So I said, okay, let me just make some modifications to her foot and see if everything looks okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I got down on my hands and knees, and for some things I learned in LJ and Diane's courses, I basically just modified her foot position, neutralized the foot, gave her some, I said, gave her some visual cues. I said, imagine in your brain, your big toes going long, your pinky toes going long, and just gave her some mental imagery to soften the foot. And I sort of lifted her. I had her for purposes of the podcast, I had her lift her heel up, and I just put my hand on her subtalar joint and tried to distract it and neutralize it. Had her put her foot down, and then we began the imagery. So I know it may be hard to imagine if you're listening to this, but if anybody has any questions, they can email me. So when I did that, I said, okay, don't move, and now stand on your left leg. And before I start there, when she stood on her left leg before, without me making any modifications, she had symptoms in her pelvis, in her SI joint. So after I neutralized her foot, she stood on the left leg. There was no pelvic shift. There was a little bit of a thoracic shift still, but much better. And she had no pain. And I was like, okay, I'm going with this to start. Because all I did was neutralize her foot. And the pelvis was pretty good after that. She didn't have any symptoms. Then the thorax was still a bit shifty, but I decided that was okay for now. Okay.
Mm-hmm. It takes time for the kinetic chain to adjust.
Exactly.
I like the way that you were talking about the feet first and taking a look at it. I don't want people to get the idea that we don't take a look at people in their running shoes, because we do, because how they stand without their shoes is just as important as how they stand in their shoes.
Yep.
And how they move in their shoes and how they move out of their shoes. That's one.
Yep.
And they probably wear different shoes when they walk the dog than they do when they run. So those are important. But I love the way that you went straight to the foot, because, and when I know you're talking about like neutralizing the foot, I think to take a little bit of the moja or the hocus pocus out of it is, I think there's a million ways that you can get at somebody's foot. And I think in one of the previous podcasts we talked about with the mature ballet dancer, that I just basically used 3 fingers, and just kind of, went right underneath the navicular, just to give her enough cueing to realize this is where, just kind of change, give a little variance. Think about a different posture for the foot. And I love the visualization of the toes growing long, because that's going to help for somebody who is over gripping, be able to stop over gripping and actually lengthen their arch, their medial arch, which is very cool. So
no, I think that's great. And she's a physio too, so I kind of
they're always so much more fun to treat.
And I think she
they get it.
She was getting it. So then I wanted to, since she traveled to see me, so I wanted to look at her hamstring power as well, just because that was a main issue for her. So so what I did next, before I got her on the table, is I had her just do a forward bend, and she complained of that pull in the hamstring. So I said, okay, let me just, modify the foot again, and let's see if that makes a difference. And it did. Not 100% though. She still had it, but it was much better. So I got her on the table. I checked her thoracic rotation and sitting. It was okay. She's a bit hypermobile, but she had some compensations where if she rotated to the right, she would side bend to the right, so she wouldn't have pure thoracic rotation. Nothing crazy in my mind at that point in the evaluation, so I moved on. Then I put her on her tummy to check her prone hip extension, because of that test being I don't know what the current evidence is on that, but that being associated with, hamstring power, hamstring strains. So I literally had her on her tummy, no pillow underneath. I had her lift her prone hip extension, had her do her right leg, it flew up, had her do her left leg, it barely moved. So I said, okay, for the heck of it. So when I looked at her doing that, she had a thoracic shift. It was pretty obvious in prone. So I couldn't sit there and neutralize her foot and have her lift her leg up. So I said, so I basically did mental imagery. I said, imagine your foot softening, similar cues to what I did in standing. I said, imagine your great toe going long, your toes are relaxing, you're softening the bottom of your foot. And when she did that, her leg flew off the table. And I sat there going, oh my God, because I didn't really touch her foot. I just had her imagine her foot softening. So, and I wanted to invalidate or validate the fact that it was not her hamstring. That was the issue.
Right. And that's so cool because you did the same movement. You just gave her a different pathway to approach it.
Right.
So, because as physios, we all tend to get all up in our head about everything. And she's probably been trying for so long not to engage her hamstrings to lift her leg because somebody told her she was probably over-engaging or something. Who knows? Who knows where it came from? But as soon as you just had her start thinking about the foot going up and the foot changing, she was doing the same motion just from a different angle, just from a different thought process. It created an entrance into the movement pattern a different way. That's fantastic. I love it.
Yeah, she was fun. And we were talking about this, and I said, we just give patients different options for movement, and their nervous systems figure it out. We're just the facilitator, I think, at the end of the day. So then what I did, so my hypothesis at that point was that because of the lack of push-off that she experienced while going up the hill, was that how do I want to even describe this? I don't want to say poor foot mechanics, but the mechanics in her foot at that point were affecting the length tension relationship of her hamstring, thus giving her that sensation of a lack of power pushing up. So I explained to her, when we, treat the foot, it should give you a better base of support from which to push off of. Mm-hmm. So because she was traveling, I started, and I had done a bunch already in that initial visit, I started treating her foot. So there's a tape that I learned a bunch of tapings in school as well, which was so long ago, but there's a couple tapings that I did learn, in several courses on how to neutralize the rear foot. So basically I distracted the medial subtalar joint, took a piece of Hypofix and then Leukotape. So it's her left foot. So I basically put on the medial side of her left foot, pulling down on, so a very short piece of tape, pulling down on the medial part of her calcaneus, and just almost like a sling, and just wrapping it around. So I distracted the medial subtalar joint and then just wrapped the tape around. And I taught her how to do that. And I also gave her, and I also treated manually, I did some work on her subtalar joint, because she had a lot, because of the old ankle sprain, I think she had probably some scarring in there, or some restriction, whatever we want to call it. And I did a lot of that, and I just did some basic joint mobilization to the subtalar joint. Once again, just to give her nervous system other options. No one had ever treated her foot. In a lot of the courses, they thought it was her thorax, and she had that treated, but she wasn't getting better. And so I sent her actually home with teaching her how to self-tape, because she could do that, and then with some just basic friction, just self-friction massage to the subtalar joint. And then I gave her a corrective exercise that I learned in one of the Discover Physio series, where if she wanted to neutralize her foot herself, all she had to do was almost like, I can't explain this on the podcast, but she almost had to drag her foot and just self-distract her foot. Maybe we should I should have a video on that. Maybe I'll do that, and I'll video it, and I'll just send it out to people, because it's hard to describe. So it was almost like you stand, and it's almost on her, you're in full standing. She has her left foot out to the side in abduction. Then she pronates her foot and then drags it, and that almost neutralizes or distracts her foot. So I had her do that, and then I had her weight shift onto that left foot, onto that neutralized quote-unquote foot. So I basically gave her the tape, the self-friction, and then the weight shift onto a self-corrected foot with the tape, or just doing the dragging and dropping, as we say.
So I just love this, because neurologically I'm thinking about all of the different things that are going on. And, when you put the leg out into abduction and you begin to drag it in to like you say, distract the subtalar a little bit and get that rolling, you actually are going to be putting the foot in a position to where when she brings that across that way, her perineals have to kick on. And if you have a chronic ankle sprain or a big one that never really didn't just kind of stayed into the ankle sprain pattern, the perineals are generally not, they're inhibited. They're not working as well. So they're bringing on. But here's the coolest thing. Now you're bringing in the adductors and the hip abductors.
Mm-hmm.
Just because you're bringing the adductors on, the hip abductors are going to have to, she brings her, as it comes up underneath her leg and as she begins to shift over, you're bringing in the lateral sling there, which is like, fantastic. So now neurologically, she's working her foot all the way up to her hip.
Mm-hmm.
And you're giving her a different way to get onto her leg, so she's not just putting her foot down and standing on it. She's having to get up onto her leg from a different position. So again, a little variance around the pattern, and just seeing how the nervous system is going to sort that out. But I think that's fantastic.
Yeah,
and
no.
we've talked about taping before. I think the sensory input that taping gives is kind of what does it. So it is more of a neurological thing than it is than an actual hold the bone thing.
Correct.
But it is, one of those things, and this is good. This is like really looking outside the box and bringing in rotation and the coronal plane into this person's patterns, or sagittal plane pattern, which is lovely.
I know, and we've talked about this with although her rotation was okay, runners need to rotate. I mean, I've looked at various over the years patterns of running. Some people run with no rotation at all and they're fine. Mm-hmm. But some people have got one arm back and that's how they run, and like rotation. And at some point, my belief is if they continue to run like that, something's going to buckle, and it may not be pain. It may be lack of endurance. It may be fatigue. It may be something, and they're going to compensate until they run out of options. And I think with her, she ran out of options. And speaking of ankle sprains, I think this is my big soapbox thing. I think people who have ankle sprains, they're like, oh, I don't need to get it treated. It'll be fine. I cannot tell you the amount of people who've had persistent ankle sprains and they get better, and that's a factor in their current pain presentation, whether it's their foot, their back, or their neck. Because people who have old ankle sprains, if don't get it treated, they should get it treated, even if it's for 2 visits, because that's just my thing. And I've had a personal experience with that with my own feet.
Yeah. Well, I think again, with any injury, we end up with we have our nervous system has the option of so many patterns, and it can set up a over recruitment inhibition pattern. It can set up a protection pattern. And that can be in various forms of maybe even a shortened stride length, or a lack of inability to go through the rotation through the subtalar joint. Which can set up a change of rotation up the spine. So it's not that we're picking on the running pattern itself as the problem, but what we're trying to do is find out where things have gone a little bit crazy in the running pattern. So, it may not be that the fact that this person kind of hangs back on her heels so much is her problem, if that was what it was, for instance, but it's because there has been, some things that have set up. So now that one leg can't work in the same way that it did before. It's having to work around this new axis of motion and this new change and overactivity of the toe flexors and probably medial ankle muscles, the posterior tib and such, to keep her on the side of her foot where she, doesn't really, maybe before never was, but now is.
Yeah.
So it's not that, what I'm saying? It's not like we're taking somebody's running pattern and picking it apart and saying, you have to change this and this and this. We're just looking at a pattern within a pattern.
Exactly.
To say what's really happened and what's different. So somebody who runs a little asymmetrically left to right, if they never ever have any kind of issues that ever happen, they're probably going to be just fine. But if they fall or hurt themselves or something changes, then that pattern may not be as conducive to it anymore, and we have to help them balance. But I think the other piece of this is the more variance you can give somebody around something, the more choices that they have, the more richness of motor control they have.
Yeah, yeah.
And it sounds like to me she had lost some of her motor control richness.
Yeah.
And it was this pain protection pattern was kind of rearing its ugly head with it.
And I think when you go on a lot of courses, and if you have issues yourself, you people sort of pick up on that. And she was just, this is thorax, and thorax is important, but it wasn't her primary issue in this case. And I did give her, I'm just looking at my notes, I gave her a couple calf stretches to do because that muscle was so tight, probably pulling on the foot. Half foam roll, knee bent, knee straight, I gave her. I also gave her, because I believe she had some access to Pilates, the Wunda box in Pilates. So I had her do some push downs on it to basically simulate that push off from running. And I also gave her a Warrior One pose. Just thinking in my brain, it was Warrior One, had her left leg back, right leg in front, and had her push off to simulate the push off with the back leg.
Yeah.
Because she had been doing the teacher training program, and obviously some other yoga poses like tree pose, things like that she wanted to do. But I don't tend to give a ton at the first visit. But since she was a physio and she was motivated and not working full time at that point, she was on board for doing all of that. And then she went away for 2 months. Okay. And I'll just finish up here. She came back. She was feeling much better, and walking the dog was easier. She was able to power up the hills a lot more, just much better, and her balance was much better. So what I did is I just rechecked everything, the forward bend, the one-legged balance, the prone hip extension. So the only thing that I found at that point was the prone hip extension. She still had a little bit of a loss of power, although she said it was much better. Everything was significantly better, but she still, even though she could power up hills, she still had a hard time lifting that leg off the table. It was better. So the foot, I still felt that was the primary issue, but she still had the shift in her thorax. So for just the purposes of the podcast, and I don't want to get anybody totally confused, what I ended up doing is I just decompressed her thorax a little bit, and had her do some imagery in her head again with her foot, because I couldn't do my hand. My arm span is not that long. So she's in prone hip extensions on the table. I had her neutralize her foot again with the imagery. And I just went up and I just prevented her thorax from shifting, to be honest. And her leg was significantly better. So at that point, I think the point that I'm making here is that with the persistent issues, in my experience, there's always a secondary problem. It may be small, but it may be that one extra thing that they need to do to improve their athletic performance, to get back to full function. And I don't need to get into the details of how I treated her with the thorax. I've done that many times on the podcast, but her foot was the primary issue, but her thorax was probably secondary, maybe 70-30, 80-20. So when I ended up treating the thorax a bit, she was good to go. So the point I was making is that if someone's plateaued and you really found that you've honed in on the primary issue, there's the longer they've had the issue, there's some small secondary issue, as you know, that's just you need to treat. And it may be their symptomatic part. It may not be. With her, I didn't touch her symptomatic part, but it may be that you may have to do that as well. So that's her.
Yeah, no, I think that's great because, a lot of people would say, okay, so you see this big thoracic shift when she stands on one leg. The first inclination may be to go to correct that, I shouldn't say correct that, to get in and just kind of see what happens when you don't allow that shift to occur. How does it fall apart? That may and you may notice that maybe the foot changed when you did it that way. It's hard to say. The idea is that had been done time and time again, and it didn't create the long-lasting change that she was looking for. And so sometimes you have to start somewhere, because you may see that second or tertiary thing pop up like big, and you may not see it the first time, and that's okay, but don't keep hammering at it. Is my point. If they come back and they're not any better, or it's only minimally better, it's like, okay, well, we've done this piece. It hasn't done the change that I'm looking for. Let me look down the chain, up the chain, to the side of the chain, whatever. But, don't be afraid to look far away from the area to see where you can also come in to create a difference in their pattern versus just going right for either the symptomatic site or the most obvious piece right next to it.
Right. And I think with her, you're correct, is that I knew the thorax had been treated and she wasn't getting better. But the most obvious thing was her foot. That was the first thing that went. And the first thing that went is what I go for as a rule of thumb for me. So that's her happy ending. So she's doing well. And I think she's in med school now, actually, to be honest. And
good for her.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people, I've been asked before, didn't you do any special tests for the pelvis? No. Because it wasn't the driver. It wasn't her primary issue. And I didn't feel a need to do that because people like this, we're not their first rodeo. We're like their 10th, they've had all this done before. So,
and it's not acute.
It's not acute.
Right.
Exactly.
This has been persistent.
Exactly.
So
Yep.
whether or not SI dysfunction, whether you believe that or not, or SI sensitivity or SI changes have occurred, that still may not be the first place that you would go, because maybe something else is the one thing that's kind of either keeping the nervous system hypersensitive around there, or or maybe if you are going to believe that, some females may have, especially if they're hypermobile, may have a little bit, maybe a millimeter more of movement in that highly proprioceptive joint. How are you going to treat it? We're still going to have to figure out how to change the pattern and get them in a position to where it's not always hurting or always being so hypersensitive. And you have to look down at the foot, or you have to look at the knee, or you have to look up above, and you have to see, gosh, why is this happening? She hadn't been pregnant. She didn't come in with she wasn't pregnant at the time, or early postpartum.
Nope.
She didn't come in with a huge fall onto the buttock. She did have an ankle sprain. Maybe that would be something I would look at kind of down the road, but I do these other tests first, simply to see if I can get a change in the pattern and a change in their symptoms right away, then I'm on the right track.
Yep, I agree.
I can always go in with my manual therapy later and work on something that may be persistently being guarded, or persistently still, difficult to get the neurology around the joint to change, with the muscular control. But if I can get in first and make a change in pattern, just much like you did. You just went right to her foot, got her to figure out how to stand differently, and gave her a different pathway for movement. Right away, she could clear up a lot of her stuff, and then you can see what's left over. It's so much easier.
And on this note, is the key with these patients, it's you need to get the buy-in on the first visit.
Yeah.
I don't care how you do it, because they've been everywhere, and if they see the same stuff, they're walking out the door.
It's like the Johnny Cash song.
Exactly. So
I've been everywhere, man. I've been everywhere. Yep, exactly.
Yeah, so there you go. Well, hope everybody enjoyed that one, and I enjoyed treating her, so there you go.
All right.
All right, thanks,
if you have any questions, you feel free to, how to get in touch with us. You should notice that we have a link to our newsletter email to find out what's going on with Tough to Treat and where we are and what we're doing. We've got some live courses going to be announced at some point, and our mentoring sessions are being announced. And sign up for these newsletters, or I guess it's an email actually.
Yes, email.
Yeah, sign up for the email for Tough to Treat, and subscribe to us on iTunes or Spotify. Keep leaving your reviews. There's places for questions even on iTunes and Spotify that we can answer for you directly there as well. So thank you for listening, and happy patient treating.
Bye.
Bye.